The wind carried a scent of damp pine and cold stone as Father Luca Maren stepped through the arched iron gate of St. Orielle's Monastery. The gate groaned, the sound splitting the morning stillness like a warning. Ravenmoor Forest stood like a fortress behind the abandoned convent, its trees crooked with age and heavy with whispers. 28 years had passed, and yet the silence here felt too immediate, too watchful, like a place that remembered pain vividly and held its breath at the return of the one who never stopped mourning. The chapel's stained glass windows, once radiant with color and faith, were now dulled by time and mildew. Moss climbed the stone walls like fingers reaching up from the grave. Father Luca's boots echoed on the cracked marble as he entered the nave, his breath visible in the morning chill. His collar tugged slightly against his throat, a subtle reminder of duty or guilt. He paused beneath the broken bell tower, eyes rising to the fractured wooden beam where a bell used to hang. He remembered its sound, clear, sacred. It had rung out one last time on the night they vanished. 5 women, sisters in faith, and among them Sister Tessa Maren, his sister by blood, and his spiritual mirror. She had been 22, devoted, kind, and entirely too radiant for a place so cold. The morning of their departure had been unusually warm for late autumn. The 5 nuns had packed light for a 2-day retreat, taking only scripture, bread, and rosaries. They left behind their personal belongings in tidy rows within the dormitory, an act of faith that they would return. But they didn't. When the groundskeeper found their absence suspicious and entered the chapel that night, he found a strange stillness, prayer books left open, pew cushions still warm. Most chilling of all was the statue of the Virgin Mary in the chapel center. It wept. Not metaphorically, real liquid, thick and red, trailed down her porcelain cheeks. The groundskeeper fled. No one stayed after that night. Not even the bishop could explain it. The convent was shuttered within days. Official statements cited a structural hazard. Unofficially, whispers of a curse rippled through the devout. Father Luca had begged to stay. He had pleaded with the diocese to let him investigate. But he was too close, they said. Too emotional. It would cloud his judgment. And perhaps they were right, because he had never stopped hearing Tessa's voice in the chapel walls, never stopped feeling her presence in prayer or waking with her name on his lips. Now 28 years later, he returned not as a priest on assignment, but as a brother seeking answers. The world had moved on, but he had not. And something he couldn't name, had drawn him back this morning. A whisper in confession, a chill in the sanctuary, a candle that refused to extinguish. Faith sometimes worked that way, or madness did. He walked past the pews now, gloved fingers trailing across the backs, whispering the names of each woman as he passed. Sister Tessa Maren, Sister Miriam Dell, Sister Honora Lewis, Sister Catherine Bird, Sister Camilla Rhodes. 5 women who walked into the forest of Ravenmoor and never came back. No remains, no witnesses, no trails, just the story of a bleeding statue and a priest whose grief refused to grow old. In the chapel, the altar stood shrouded beneath a dirty linen cloth. He removed it gently, revealing the cold stone beneath. Dust rose like breath. Then he knelt, crossed himself, and whispered, "Lord, if they sleep beneath this earth, let me dream the truth." His voice echoed off the hollow walls. Then a sound, a soft click, stone on stone. Luca turned. The door to the confessional booth had swung open, though he hadn't touched it. The air inside shifted. Something old stirred. He approached with careful steps, heart racing, hand reaching instinctively for the cross on his chest. Inside a candle, unlit, but still warm to the touch. He picked it up. There, scratched into the wood of the booth's inner panel, were words he had never seen before. They are beneath the veil. But she still sings. His knees nearly gave. She, Tessa? That night, 28 years ago, he remembered waking at 3:33 a.m. with a start. He dreamt of Tessa standing in the chapel, arms spread like wings, singing an ancient hymn. That same phrase, she still sings, had repeated in his dream. He had dismissed it as grief then. But now, staring at the message carved into the confession booth, he felt the weight of something bigger, something holy or haunted. The veil. Was it metaphorical, spiritual, or something literal, something buried beneath this sacred ground? He looked toward the base of the altar. The floor was made of flagstones, thick and uneven. Was it possible something was below? Something hidden? He retrieved his small flashlight from his coat pocket and shined it across the stones. One near the corner gleamed differently, as if recently disturbed. He pressed it. It didn't move. Not yet. Not today. He left the chapel with the candle wrapped in cloth, the carved message etched into memory, and a decision made. He would return, but not alone. As he exited through the nave, the breeze blew in through a shattered stained glass window. Dust whirled through the air, and in that swirling pattern, just for a second, Luca thought he saw the shape of a hand pressed to the glass. Small, feminine, fading fast. He didn't speak, didn't pray. He simply whispered, "I see you," and stepped out into the light. Father Luca returned to St. Agnes Parish with the candle wrapped carefully in cloth and the etched message still fresh in his mind, his footsteps slower than when he arrived that morning, his eyes deeper with questions he had no language to frame. The weight of that small chapel door opening on its own, and the hidden message suggesting Tessa still sings, had cracked something within him, a certainty long held that she was gone. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he pored over the archived reports from 1981, some photocopied so many times they were little more than shadows of text. The files had not aged well, but they held enough shape to show the initial timeline of confusion, followed quickly by administrative silence. The official narrative had settled swiftly. 5 nuns disappeared during a retreat, presumed lost in the vastness of Ravenmoor Forest, likely victims of wildlife or natural hazard. Without bodies, there was no evidence to suggest foul play, and with no sign of struggle or escape from the convent, the diocese had clung tightly to the explanation of natural disappearance. Father Luca remembered how he had screamed at the bishop in those days, demanding deeper search parties, aerial scans, forensic teams. He remembered the way the bishop had laid a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "We grieve, Luca, but we do not chase ghosts." But what if the ghosts had never left? Back then, the grounds had been combed by police dogs, helicopters circled for weeks, and divers had even searched a nearby lake fed by the stream that ran behind the convent. Not a single item was recovered, not a scrap of fabric, no rosaries, no shoes, no journals, nothing. Their beds were still made. Their toothbrushes remained. The last entry in the chapel's visitor log was a single word, "Quiet," written in Sister Camilla's looping hand. The log ended there, and so did the official investigation. Over the following year, interest in the case dwindled. Media turned their attention elsewhere. The diocese quietly redirected funds, and St. Orielle's, once a place of pilgrimage, became a symbol of misfortune, whispered about but rarely mentioned in homilies. A plaque honoring the 5 women was placed in the garden of St. Agnes, a token gesture beneath ivy and forgetfulness. Father Luca had tried to push harder, even traveled to Rome to seek intervention, but the church had little appetite for haunting stories with no clear resolution. Exactly 1 year later, in the fall of 1982, the diocese issued a formal closure notice. St. Orielle's was declared unsafe, citing water damage and irreparable foundational decay, though no structural assessment was made public. The keys were returned to the bishop's office. Or so it was believed. What no one outside the clergy circles ever knew was that someone had quietly requested permission to maintain spiritual watch over the grounds. That someone was Father Declan Varelli, the aging assistant to the abbess, a man few noticed during his decades of silent service. He had a calm presence, rarely spoke more than a few words, and was known for his deep love of solitude. He was also the last person to see the 5 sisters alive. He had claimed to have been away the evening they disappeared, visiting his sick brother 2 towns over. A local inn had confirmed his presence late that night. Still, there was unease about how quickly he had returned the following morning, just minutes after the groundskeeper discovered the empty beds and the bleeding statue. No one questioned him deeply. After all, he was a priest. And grief, they said, plays strange games with memory. But something in the records stood out to Father Luca now. A maintenance report dated 6 months after the closure and signed, with no department attached, listed minor lighting restored to lower levels. What lighting? The chapel basement had been sealed. He traced the address listed for the document's delivery, and his heart slowed. It wasn't the bishop's office. It was a post office box under a name Luca didn't recognize, but one that, after further digging, led back to Father Declan. Had Declan returned? Not just returned. Had he never left? Further inquiry revealed a hushed transfer of the property deed to an independent religious steward, a vague title granted only under rare circumstances. Father Declan had petitioned the diocese in writing, requesting permission to stay as guardian of sacred silence, citing his unique spiritual connection to the grounds. The bishop, perhaps eager to rid himself of the place, had consented. From that moment on, no one officially monitored the property, and Declan, it seemed, had slipped quietly into the forgotten halls of St. Orielle's, settling not in the priest's quarters or the rectory, but in a room beneath the chapel, one that wasn't on any official map. This revelation sent tremors through Father Luca. Why live underground? Why remain at a place so soaked in tragedy? Unless he was hiding something. Unless he had always known more than he let on. A surviving nun from another convent, Sister Lizette, remembered visiting Declan once after the closure. She said he looked thinner, hollow-eyed, and carried a crucifix with a splintered edge, always clutched against his chest. He prayed like he was bargaining, she recalled. Like he thought God might change his mind. As Lucas sat in the candlelit archives of the church, he reviewed every incident report, every diary page, every rumor. A few lines from a journal kept by Sister Miriam haunted him. Father Declan has started sleeping in the sacristy. He says the lower rooms speak to him in dreams. I worry for him. Another entry from Sister Camilla read, He gave us bread baked in silence. He says silence preserves faith. And the last, the most chilling, from Sister Tessa herself. He watches us like we're already gone. Now Father Luca felt the edges of the truth curling like paper near a flame. If Declan had remained, if he had lived in those depths for years, praying in isolation, what had he truly seen? Or worse, what had he done? He knew he had to return, but not alone. He needed help. He needed permission. He needed to open the floor beneath the chapel. But most of all, he needed to know if the silence Declan had protected so fiercely was one of peace or penance. Because silence this deep was never innocent. The morning rain had just started when Father Luca stepped into the rectory office, balancing a mug of black coffee and a stack of parish bulletins. The wind outside carried a restlessness he couldn't name, a charge in the air like static before a storm. He moved through the narrow hallway, nodding to Sister Pauline as she passed with her gardening gloves still damp from the courtyard, then reached his desk, expecting nothing more than a quiet morning of planning homilies and updating the church calendar. But something was already waiting. A small package, wrapped in aged brown paper and sealed with twine, sat precisely at the center of his desk. No return address, no stamp. The handwriting on the front was blocky, deliberate, as if written by someone with trembling hands or unfamiliar fingers. His name, Father Luca Maren, was written in red ink that had bled slightly through the paper, giving it a bruised appearance. For several moments, he simply stared at it. His fingers hovered above the twine, hesitant, until some deeper instinct compelled him to pull. The knot came undone easily, like it had been tied for ritual rather than security. Inside a book, thin, worn, its leather cover cracked along the edges. A crucifix embossed on the front had faded into near invisibility, but the initials inside the cover were unmistakable. T.M. Tessa Maren. He recognized the handwriting instantly, his sister's, delicate but firm, the same she'd used to label all her belongings during their youth. He thumbed through the pages, stunned to find pressed violets still tucked between the psalms, one of them stained a deep rust red. Blood. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't aged to brown either. The sight of it turned his stomach in a slow, deliberate twist. Some pages were torn. Others bore underlined verses, circled with faint pencil and tiny notes like prayers between lines. One stood out. Even if I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Psalm 139, verse 8. He read it again, and a third time, heart beginning to race. There was no letter, no explanation, just this book, and the blood. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting the spine, the inner binding, searching for any clue to its journey. It looked weathered, too weathered to have been stored carefully, yet too intact to have been lost in the wild for 28 years. It had been kept, protected, carried, and now it had been sent to him. By whom? And why now? His mind cycled through possibilities. Was it a cruel hoax? A relic recovered from some unrelated crime scene? But no, the handwriting was too perfect, the pressed flowers too familiar. This had been hers. He placed the book gently on the table, rising to retrieve a small evidence bag from the file room. As he stepped away, the church's old radio, sitting dusty on the windowsill for over a decade, crackled to life. The sound was jarring, sharp against the rain's rhythm, and it made him turn instantly. The dial had remained untouched since 2003, when a lightning strike had rendered it inoperable. Every attempt to revive it had failed, and eventually the parish stopped trying. Yet now, without any prompting, it hummed. A low static gave way to a soft, distant voice. Singing. Female. Delicate, like silk brushed against candlelight. Luca froze. The melody curled through the room with uncanny clarity, each note reverent, unmistakably sacred. He knew the hymn. Everyone did. It was Tessa's favorite. Ave Maris Stella. Hail, Star of the Sea. The same hymn she had sung the day before she vanished. He had recorded it once on an old cassette player during choir practice. She had laughed, embarrassed, saying her voice was never meant for permanence. But it had stayed with him, and now it played again, but not from a tape, not from any device he controlled, just from the radio. Its screen remained dead. No light, no signal strength, just that voice pouring gently into the room like incense. His hand trembled as he reached for the plug. It wasn't connected. The radio wasn't even on. It simply sang. He stepped back, stunned, a cold sweat forming along his spine. For several minutes, he stood motionless, heart thudding as Tessa's voice rose and fell, haunting and holy, echoing off the plaster walls. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the song ended. A single chime rang out like a bell struck deep in the earth, and the room fell silent. No static, no final breath, nothing. Luca sat down slowly, hands pressed together in a half-formed prayer. What was this? A message? A hallucination? Some electromagnetic fluke? But he knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, in the place that still called her name in the night, he knew this was her. Somehow, Tessa was reaching out, and whatever force had held her silent for nearly 3 decades was weakening. The next hours were a blur. He brought the book to the bishop's office, where it was photographed and filed, but no formal action was taken. The bishop, though visibly disturbed, urged caution. "Grief does not obey the laws of time," he said gently, "and sometimes it returns in the form of stories we wish were true." But Luca wasn't interested in theories. He requested permission again to revisit St. Orielle's officially. This time, he wouldn't go in grief. He would go in search. That night, he sat alone in his rectory, the book beside him, the radio unplugged but still ominously present. He opened the book once more, this time scanning every note, every margin, looking for patterns. In the back pages, he found something strange, a hand-drawn symbol, one he didn't recognize. A triangle pointing down, encircled by what appeared to be 5 drops of blood. 5. The number chilled him. 5 women, 5 lost, and perhaps one still calling. The cold arrived before the sun, seeping into Father Luca's coat and settling in his bones as he stood once more before the looming silhouette of St. Orielle's Monastery. The grounds were overgrown now, ivy and bramble curling through the broken iron gates, the path obscured by decades of nature reclaiming stone. The chapel's bell tower tilted like a grieving sentinel, its wooden frame cracked from seasons of wind and neglect. But the structure still stood, silent and waiting, as if holding its breath for what was to come. He crossed the threshold just after dawn, flashlight in hand, heart thudding in the quiet. The air inside was colder than he remembered, thick with the scent of old incense, mildew, and something more metallic, faint but unmistakable. The crucifix above the altar had fallen, resting sideways against the wall, its arms outstretched like a warning. The room had not changed much since his last visit, though time had chipped away at details. Candles long melted to nubs, velvet cushions threadbare, the pews bowed under the weight of dust and decay. He moved past them slowly, the echo of his steps swallowed by the dense silence. With every step, the memory of Tessa's voice lingered, the hymn she had sung still alive in his ears. He turned toward the confessional booth, hesitating. It hadn't opened this time. No sound, no whisper, but something in his chest pulled him forward, the same magnetism that had drawn him here year after year with no explanation. The door creaked as he opened it, and the smell hit him first, stale wood, trapped air, and something faintly sweet, like old candle wax. The interior looked unchanged, but this time, as he lowered himself onto the wooden seat, his hand brushed against something wedged beneath the bench. He reached down, fingers meeting cool plastic. A cassette tape, unmarked, dusty, but intact. He turned it over slowly, noting the faint smear of ink on one side, illegible now, faded by time. His fingers trembled slightly as he pocketed the tape, rising quickly with his breath shallow and uneven. Just as he stepped back into the nave, the beam of his flashlight flickered, then caught on something that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had gone unnoticed all this time. Near the far left wall, behind the collapsed remnants of an old votive stand, a deep crack had spread along the stone, revealing a hollow pocket in the wall. Luca crouched, brushing debris aside, revealing a jagged opening barely wide enough to pass through. He slipped his hand into the gap, fingers brushing cold air beyond. A corridor. narrow, hidden, stone-lined, unmarked on any map or floor plan he'd ever seen. He backed away, stood, and surveyed the chapel's edges. If this had gone unnoticed for decades, what else had? He returned to the confessional, retrieved the tape, and made his way to the vestry, where the old audio system used to be stored. Surprisingly, the cassette player still worked. He powered it with an old backup generator he had brought in anticipation. The device whirred to life, crackling with static before a voice emerged. Male, gravelly, slow. The first words were a prayer. Domini exaudi orationem meam, Lord, hear my prayer. Then a pause, a breath, and a voice that slid from reverent to unhinged in a single sentence. They would not be quiet. Even as the light faded, they sang. I told them silence would save them. Luca's heart stopped cold. The voice continued, distorted slightly by time, but clear enough to understand. I brought them closer to God. I built them a place of stillness, of purity. I kept them near enough to hear the heartbeat of the sacred. I washed them clean in quiet. I gave them darkness so they would finally see. The tape crackled, hissed, then resumed. They resisted. One prayed too loudly. One refused food. One scratched at the door until her hands bled. But I forgave them. I forgave them all. Because their souls, their souls, were so bright they needed shielding from this world. Then the voice whispered something that made the blood drain from Luca's face. Tessa was the last. She still sings. Even now, beneath the veil. Luca pressed pause, hand trembling. It was Declan. The voice belonged to Father Declan Varelli. There was no mistaking it now. The man who had remained behind. The man who had claimed to protect sacred silence. He had confessed to imprisoning them, to keeping them underground, and perhaps still alive, at least for some time. The thought made Luca stagger. He pressed play again, needing to hear it all. I watched them sleep through stone. I brought them food blessed with psalms. I anointed their heads when they cried. They were safe, until the voices began to echo through the floor, until I could hear him call their names, not mine. The tape ended there, snapping in the player with an audible click. Luca sat in the dark, mouth dry, stomach churning. The confessional was no longer a place of redemption. It was a tomb of secrets, and perhaps proof of a crime the church had buried out of fear or ignorance. He rose, flashlight steady again, and made his way back to the wall. The crack yawned like a wound. He pulled at the edges, dislodging more loose stone until the opening widened enough to reveal the beginning of a staircase, descending into blackness. The air that drifted out was cold and damp, tinged with something organic, moss, soil, and another faint trace. Oil, incense, old prayers trapped in stone. He knew what this was. It was the place Declan had built, the place he had called closer to God. Luca stepped toward it, the darkness swallowing the edge of his light beam, the silence pressing in like a second skin. He took one breath, then another, and then he began to descend. The descent into the tunnel beneath St. Orielle's was not long, but it was steep, the stone steps slick with condensation and warped by decades of disuse. Father Luca moved cautiously, flashlight sweeping over mold-covered walls and support beams now bowed under their own age. The air was dense, thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint, lingering musk of candle smoke long extinguished. It was not just a hidden basement, it was a network, and the farther he went, the more he realized it had been designed with purpose, not as storage or shelter, but as something sacred or sinister. When the passage finally opened into a circular chamber, Luca's light revealed faded symbols etched into stone, crosses turned sideways, Latin phrases carved in haphazard fashion, and one phrase repeated around the walls like a chant: ad inferos perfidum, to the underworld through faith. A shiver ran down his spine. There were no remains here, no furniture, no relics, just walls, whispers, and the sound of water dripping from an unseen pipe. He knew he needed to come back with proper equipment, maybe even law enforcement. But as he turned to leave, something snapped in the darkness beyond the tunnel mouth. A branch? A footfall? His light jerked up toward the noise, but it revealed nothing. Still, he didn't wait. He climbed the steps 2 at a time, heart thudding, and emerged into the chapel gasping, as if he had surfaced from underwater. The air outside was colder now, and dusk had settled over Ravenmoor like a veil. He locked the chapel doors behind him, not for safety, but as if sealing the memory, and stepped into the path that led toward the forest edge. Ravenmoor had always unnerved him. The trees grew too closely, and the light inside the woods never felt quite real. As a child, he had believed stories told by the local boys, of shadows moving between branches, of voices that mimicked your name, of an old man with yellow eyes who patrolled the woods at night. Superstitions, of course. Yet as he made his way back to the main road, flashlight now off, something pricked at the back of his neck. A feeling, an instinct, watchfulness. Halfway down the trail, he saw movement ahead, just beyond the tree line. A figure, tall, still, wearing something long and dark. Luca stopped. The figure did not. Slowly it stepped forward, and as it neared the edge of the trail, the failing light revealed a face obscured by a crude wooden mask, carved in the likeness of a man's screaming mouth, hollow-eyed and splintered. Luca froze. The figure spoke not with words, but a sharp whistle, shrill and high-pitched, followed by a gesture. A finger raised and pointed directly at him. Then, in a voice low and cracked like broken stone, it growled, "You shouldn't be here, priest. Not again." Luca's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he demanded, backing slightly. "What do you know of this place?" The masked man did not answer directly. Instead, he stepped forward again, surprisingly agile for someone his age, because now, even through the mask and cloak, Luca could tell this man was not young. His shoulders were hunched not with tension, but age. His hands, visible beneath threadbare gloves, were lined with deep creases. "The dead don't want to be disturbed," the man rasped. "But you've stirred the veil, and the veil doesn't like to be moved." "Did you send the book?" Luca asked, taking a step closer despite his better judgment. "The radio? The tape?" The man shook his head slowly. "Not me. But something did. And it brought you back, didn't it?" Then he turned suddenly and began walking into the deeper part of the woods, waving a gloved hand without looking back. "Come." Against every rational voice in his mind, Luca followed. The trail narrowed and twisted, leading past old stone markers overgrown with moss, past trees with bark scarred by symbols he didn't recognize. Finally, the man stopped at the edge of a clearing, knelt, and unearthed a flat wooden box buried beneath a cairn of stones. He handed it to Luca without a word. The box was light. Inside, a carved slab of wood no bigger than a clipboard, smooth from years of handling. Upon its surface was a map, not drawn, but engraved, deep grooves etched by a patient hand, forming a detailed outline of St. Orielle's Monastery, the surrounding woods, and something else, a network of tunnels. Arteries of stone connecting the chapel to 3 locations, an abandoned well, a crumbled stone circle, and something labeled in Latin, Sepulchrum Vetus, the old tomb. Luca looked up, wide-eyed. Where did this come from? The man removed his mask slowly, revealing a weathered face, thick with beard and eyes sharp beneath heavy lids. "You wouldn't remember me, but I was the ranger assigned here in '81, he said, voice softer now. I warned them not to build on this land. Told them the forest doesn't forget. But they laughed, called me a drunk, a madman. And now? Luca asked, nearly breathless. Now I watch, the man replied. Because sometimes the dead don't stay buried. And sometimes it's not the devil you find underground, but the reflection of your own blind faith. The priest stood in silence, the map heavy in his hands. The old man stepped away without another word, disappearing into the brush like a wraith. Luca didn't follow. He stared at the map, tracing the line from the chapel to the marked tomb at the edge of the forest. And somewhere beneath his fingers he felt the map grow colder, as if the wood still remembered what it had been carved to reveal. Father Luca stood before the narrow entrance at the rear of the chapel, the map clutched in one hand, the other gripping the flashlight that now seemed inadequate against the yawning blackness beyond the broken stone. The previous night's encounter with the forest ranger, the man with the mask and grave voice, had rattled him. But what weighed heavier now was what that map revealed. Not a single passage, but a network, veins of shadow running from chapel to forgotten places. He had returned before dawn with 2 sheriff deputies, both skeptical, but willing to investigate after hearing the cassette and reviewing the strange item Luca found buried in the confessional wall. The priest didn't reveal the map's origin, only that it pointed to an access point below the altar, and that what they might find could pertain to the long unsolved disappearance of the 5 nuns. They agreed to proceed cautiously, one of them notifying dispatch and requesting backup to stand by. The tunnel entrance was narrow, lined with stone older than the rest of the chapel's foundation, suggesting it had been built separately or earlier. They descended in silence, the beams of their lights dancing across damp walls where moss clung to the mortar and faint traces of soot marked the corners like smudged memories. After a steep descent, the passage opened into a corridor lined with 5 doors, each recessed into the stone like cells in a forgotten prison. The first door bore a wooden plaque, long decayed, but still bearing the outline of a nameplate. The hinges screamed as one of the deputies pushed it open. Inside, the chamber was small, barely large enough to stand and turn. On the far wall, a niche had been carved, and within it rested a figurine, a saint, but turned upside down. A single candle sat on the floor, melted into the stone, its wick blackened but intact. The air was thick and sour, untouched by daylight or prayer. One by one, they opened the doors. Each cell told a similar story. The same arrangement, an upturned figurine, a spent candle, and a hollowed emptiness that pulsed with spiritual weight. One had a rosary, broken, with beads scattered like teeth on the ground. Another bore scratch marks on the wall, tally lines perhaps, or pleas, each stroke a silent scream. It wasn't until they reached the 5th cell that something changed. The flashlight swept across the room and caught the glint of something metallic near the wall, small, curved, and half buried in dust. Luca stepped forward, knelt, and carefully retrieved the object. A comb, wooden, hand-carved. The initials TM were etched into the base. Several strands of hair were still entwined within the teeth, pale and brittle with age. His breath caught in his throat. "This was hers," he said quietly, and the deputies exchanged glances before placing it into an evidence bag. But it wasn't just the comb. As Luca turned to examine the wall behind it, his light caught on something else, writing, carved not with precision, but with desperation. The words in Latin were uneven trembling. Orimus etiam sine calo. He translated it aloud. "We still pray, even without the sky." One deputy whispered a curse under his breath. The words echoed in the small room, each syllable landing like a stone in water. Luca reached out to trace the letters with his gloved fingers, the grooves still sharp, still angry. This wasn't just a prison. It was a confessional, a grave, a place where hope had been asked to kneel until its knees bled. He stood slowly, every bone in his body feeling older, heavier. One of the deputies called in the discovery, describing the setup of the chambers, the symbols, the evidence of prolonged confinement. They would need a full team, forensics, anthropologists, and someone from the diocese. But Luca couldn't move. Not yet. His eyes locked onto the wall, behind the writing. There, barely visible in the mortar, was the faint outline of a cross. It had been carved lightly, then obscured, perhaps by whoever later chiseled the inverted saint into the room. A battle of faiths waged in shadows. He wondered how long Tessa had been here. Days? Weeks? Years? And had she been the one who wrote that final prayer? DNA testing would later confirm that the hair matched Tessa Maren, and this room, this forgotten crypt beneath the house of God, had held her alive, at least for some time. But the walls held no more answers that day. No bones. No screams. Only the heavy hush of a place that had seen too much and said too little. Luca walked back into the corridor, his flashlight flickering as though reacting to something he could not see. The air pressed closer now, thicker, colder, like breath on the back of the neck. The other deputies were waiting at the entrance, already preparing to seal the tunnel and secure the area for further investigation. But Luca lingered. There was something else. The map. The line that extended from this corridor did not end here. It kept going. The map, now laminated and marked with color-coded annotations by the forensic team, indicated a second chamber not directly accessible from the main corridor of cells, but branching from a sealed threshold beneath the altar. It had been overlooked during the initial sweep due to a collapsed section of stone, likely from an old cave-in. But once Luca directed them to the symbol-marked cecellum, a sublevel sacristy hidden beneath the old altar room, the excavation team began removing the rubble. What they uncovered was a narrow tunnel that sloped downward, its walls carved more deliberately than the cell corridor, with faint remnants of religious iconography along the ceiling, all heavily defaced. The smell worsened with every step, mildew, stale air, and a hint of something older, something long sealed and not meant to be opened. As they reached the bottom, the chamber widened into what once may have been a private crypt or clergy prayer room. A stone pedestal sat in the center, over which hung a rusted chain once used to lower ceremonial candles. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, all warped with age, filled with books, relics, and dozens of melted wax stubs fused to ceramic holders. But one item stood out, wrapped in decaying cloth, bound in cracked leather, and sealed with a wax cross was a thick handwritten journal, its edges brittle and stained. Luca opened it carefully, and the air changed, as if the room itself inhaled. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, controlled, and increasingly erratic across the pages. It belonged to Father Declan Varelli. The first entries were dated weeks before the sisters disappeared. He wrote of dreams, prophecies, shadows in the chapel that whispered when no one was near. He referenced scripture not as guidance, but as code, interpreting verses through a filter of obsession and fear. He described Ravenmoor as the throat of the world, a place where God's voice was clearest because the veil between flesh and spirit was thin. But as the entries continued, a descent into madness became clear. He became convinced that the world outside the convent had already begun to fall, spiritually, if not yet visibly. News reports about wars, economic collapses, and moral decay fueled his belief that the apocalypse had already begun, and that the sisters entrusted to him were to be preserved, purified, and shielded. He described the construction of the underground cells as an act of faith, a sacred sanctuary where the world's corruption could not touch them. He wrote, I heard the trumpets, not in heaven, but beneath the floorboards. When they sang, the echoes rattled the bones of angels. I could not let them leave. They were too bright. The world would consume their light. One entry, dated just days before the last recorded Mass at St. Orielle's, sent chills down Luca's spine. I have sealed the final door. Tonight, I bring them their last sacrament. Their eyes look at me with confusion, but they do not fear me. They still trust. Especially her. Especially Tessa. She still sings. Every night. Even now, though the stone thickens and the candlelight fades, she sings. And in her voice, I hear absolution. Luca could barely breathe. His hand clenched the journal tighter, the pages blurring through his tears. The entries continued for weeks, then months, sporadic, increasingly disjointed, littered with drawings of inverted saints, diagrams of tunnels, passages of Latin and Aramaic. One page was entirely filled with the same phrase written over and over, "Only those in silence will rise." Then a break. The handwriting changed slightly, shakier, hurried, with ink blotches and scratch marks. It seemed he had tried to return to the rooms after sealing them, perhaps intending to check on the women. One entry stood alone on a mostly blank page. I cannot find the key. They are beyond my reach now. God has locked them in for a reason. The pages that followed were almost unreadable, filled with dark stains and the wild looping script of someone no longer tethered to reality. The final legible passage was scrawled diagonally across 2 torn pages. Tessa still sings. I think she sings for me, not in forgiveness, but in warning. One of the deputies stepped closer as Luca closed the journal, his expression unreadable. "We'll get it logged and analyzed," he said quietly, but his voice betrayed the discomfort of someone who had just glimpsed too deeply into someone else's delusion. Luca remained silent, gripping the journal like a sacred wound. This was more than evidence. It was confession, the written dissent of a man who had stood in robes, offered communion, heard sins, and committed the ultimate betrayal under the guise of salvation. A man who believed he was saving souls by breaking their bodies. Yet, amid the madness, there was one undeniable thread. Tessa. Her presence in the journal was constant, unwavering. Declan feared her, respected her, perhaps even worshipped the resilience in her voice. He could lock the doors. He could steal the light. But he could not stop her from singing. Luca stood in that cold chamber, its ceiling too low, its walls too tight, and felt for the first time that her voice might still echo somewhere, that it hadn't been extinguished, only buried. And if Declan failed to silence her faith, maybe she had survived. The following morning brought more than just sunlight through the broken stained glass windows of St. Orielle's. It brought back the full investigative team, the coroner, the crime scene technicians, and the cold weight of expectation. Father Luca remained in the chapel as they began their deeper excavation beneath the sanctuary, this time following the exact coordinates drawn in Declan's journal. The passage they uncovered led even further below the chamber that housed the priest's ramblings, descending into what could only be described as a crypt forgotten by time. The air was colder here, the stone older, rougher, bearing no signs of modern tools or recent reinforcement. As Luca moved with the investigators down the winding stairwell, he felt as though he were stepping outside of time, into a sanctified tomb crafted not by masons, but by hands driven by obsession and ritual. At the base of the stair, a sealed archway stood with a rusted iron gate embedded into the rock. It took 2 deputies to pry it open, and when the gate gave way with a tortured shriek, a corridor appeared, narrow and uneven, leading to a series of stone alcoves cut into the walls, 5 in total, spaced with ritualistic symmetry. The first alcove held the skeletal remains of a woman, her bones arranged with care, hands clasped as if still in prayer. A cracked rosary was wrapped tightly around her fingers, the beads fused into her flesh by time and pressure. A small wooden plaque above her head bore a carved initial, M.H., Sister Madeline Hayes. The second alcove revealed another body, this one seated against the wall, spine curved unnaturally, skull tilted back. She still wore a fragment of her habit, now little more than moth-eaten cloth clinging to brittle bone. Her hands were open, palms upward, as if offering something. A broken piece of stained glass rested in her lap. Initials above, J.K. Joan Keller. The third and fourth alcoves mirrored the first two, containing the remains of Beatrice Nemora and Camilla Rios, identified by small items found with them, a silver crucifix and a leather-bound psalter, respectively. Each body showed no signs of trauma, no chains, no bindings, just the slow erosion of time and silence. But the fifth alcove was empty. The stone bed was clean, swept of dust, as if someone had visited recently. There was no body, no cloth, just a cross, carved by hand from what appeared to be the remnants of a bed frame, and beside it, placed gently atop a folded piece of cloth, was a letter. Not yellowed, not faded. The ink was fresh. Luca's hands trembled as he reached for it, his breath catching in his throat. The letter was addressed simply, "To my brother Luca." He unfolded the page slowly, reverently, as if opening the very edge of a miracle. The handwriting was unmistakably Tessa's, delicate, strong, unchanged. It read, "Dear Luca, if you are reading this, then God has kept his promise. I never stopped believing he would send you. I have prayed each night not for escape, but for peace and for your strength, that you might one day find us, not with anger, but with love. I was never afraid. Even when the light went away, even when the singing stopped, I was not alone. I saw him in the silence. I heard him in the dark. I forgave Father Declan. He was ill. I think he wanted to save something beautiful from the world, but he did not understand that love cannot be locked away. I forgive him. I forgive those who forgot us. And I want you to forgive yourself for not finding us sooner. You did now, and that's enough. I will wait for you at the place we last spoke. I will sing again. Love always, your sister Tessa." Luca fell to his knees, letter in hand, tears breaking from him not in sobs, but in silence, thick, grateful silence. One of the deputies stepped forward cautiously. "There's no body," he said gently. "Are you sure she—" Luca looked up, his face pale but resolute. "She's not here," he whispered. "She was here, but she's not anymore." The cross, though crude, had been sanded smooth on one side. On its surface were more words, etched with the same care as the letter. "Faith is the light beneath the ground." Luca stood slowly, his knees aching, the weight of the letter still warm in his hand. The coroner began photographing the site, tagging each alcove, while a forensics officer collected samples from the empty fifth cell. But for Luca, the scene was already sacred. The evidence had spoken. The truth was no longer buried. And somewhere close, Tessa was still alive. The wind off the lake carried a chill that stung the skin, a steady breath of winter that hadn't yet surrendered to spring. Father Luca stood beneath a weathered wooden archway bearing the hand-carved sign, Abbaye Sainte Marguerite, just across the Canadian border, nestled between pine-covered hills and a still frozen river. The coordinates had come from an old postal record, part of a follow-up the investigators had stumbled upon. One letter, dated 2 years prior, addressed simply to the Sisters of Marguerite, postmarked from a town no longer listed on most maps. It wasn't proof, not in any legal sense, but Luca didn't need documents. He needed to hear a voice. And when he entered the small stone chapel at the heart of the property, the voice found him first. A woman was singing alone in the apse, lit only by candlelight and the dying sun through stained glass. Her posture was straight. Her hands were folded gently before her. Her face was turned slightly upward, eyes closed in prayer. The hymn she sang was unmistakable, Ave Maris Stella. But not the standard version. It was Tessa's variation, the one she had arranged when she was 19, altering the key to better suit her range, adding a subtle pause between verses that lifted the last line like breath at dawn. The sound carved through the silence of the chapel like incense through air, and for a moment, Luca stood frozen. He was no longer a man holding papers or chasing shadows. He was a boy again, standing outside the choir room, listening to his sister sing the morning mass with a voice that seemed to bend light. He took a step forward, hesitant. The woman's hair was silver, long, tucked beneath a simple veil, but a few strands had slipped free and glinted white under the candlelight. Her back did not flinch. She continued singing until the final note faded, then stood in stillness before turning. Her face had aged, the lines deeper, the eyes more shadowed, but her gaze was steady, and when she saw him, she smiled, not in shock, not in fear, but with the soft knowing of someone expecting an old friend. "You found the chambers," she said simply. Her voice no longer sang, but still carried the same clarity. Luca opened his mouth, but words failed him. He crossed the chapel slowly, his footsteps loud against the stone. "Tessa?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. She nodded once, and in that nod everything dissolved, the years, the unanswered questions, the silence. "I waited as long as I could," she whispered, "but I knew you would come. I knew it when the gate cracked and the earth moved. I felt the light shift." He reached out as if to touch her shoulder, but she stepped forward instead, pressing something into his hand, a rosary, handcrafted. The beads were pale and coarse, not of stone or wood, but something softer. "Made for my hair," she said, eyes still steady. "The one I gave you when we were children was lost in the fire, remember? So I made another, to wait, to remember, and now to return." Luca stared at the rosary, his fingers trembling as they traced the familiar threading. The frayed cord knotted at the cross. "Why here?" he finally asked. "Why not reach out? Let someone know." Tessa walked to the side of the altar, lit another candle, and sat slowly on the pew closest to the wall. "Because the world wanted saints or martyrs, not survivors, and I didn't know which one I was. Not after the others passed. Not after I buried them with my hands. Not after I realized Declan's voice still echoed in my dreams." She paused, folding her hands over her lap. "They forgave him, Luca. Even in the dark, they forgave. They prayed for his soul as he whispered madness outside their doors. I heard them. I tried to keep them warm, to share the water, the food. But the silence always came back." Luca sat beside her, his eyes filled with sorrow and awe. "And when you escaped?" he asked. "I didn't escape," she said softly. "I was released. The earth shifted after the flood season one year. A stone cracked. A crawl space opened. I followed it until I found the surface. I didn't remember how to breathe. I walked for days. No name, no memory strong enough to give. I arrived here half-starved, dressed in rags. The sisters took me in. I prayed in silence for years. Then one day, my voice returned, and with it the song." Luca's hand gripped hers gently. "You're a miracle," he whispered. "No," she replied. "I'm proof that faith doesn't die underground. It grows, slowly, like roots reaching for light." They sat in silence for several minutes, the candles flickering as dusk deepened into night. No other voices intruded. No choir, no storm. Just the two of them, the chapel, and the fragile link between past and present woven into the space between their clasped hands. Then Tessa leaned close, her voice barely audible. But Luca, there's one more place you need to go. One more door. Declan never wrote about it, but I remember. It was below even the lowest crypt. A room he called the heart. The morning was impossibly still, as if the world itself paused in reverence. Father Luca awoke to a soft knock at his door. A young sister stood in the hallway, her eyes already red, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. She did not need to speak. The air in the abbey had changed. He moved quickly, though his steps grew slower as he neared the small room at the end of the hall, the one with a single window facing east and the candle always left burning through the night. Inside, the bed was neatly made, and Tessa lay atop it, her head gently tilted to the side, a faint smile resting on her lips. Her hands, folded over her chest, still held the rosary, the same one she had given him just hours earlier, now cradled as if she had never let go. Her eyes were closed, her skin pale but peaceful. There was no fear in her face, no sign of suffering, only serenity. A nun nearby whispered. She went in her sleep just after midnight. We heard no sound, just the wind through the chapel. Luca sat beside her, tears forming slowly. He touched her hand, still warm, and whispered a prayer not just for her soul, but in thanksgiving for having found her, for having spoken with her, for the miracle of her endurance. No one would ever fully understand how she survived those years beneath stone and silence. No official record could capture the fire of her spirit, or the grace with which she forgave the man who condemned her. But he knew, and so did the women who lived alongside her in these last years, who saw the discipline in her prayers, the gentleness in her silence, and the unshakable clarity in her faith. 3 days later, the abbey reopened its chapel for the first time in decades to allow her funeral. The local townspeople came, as did pilgrims, investigators, and members of the church who had followed the rediscovery of the hidden crypt. But for Father Luca, this was not a spectacle, it was a homecoming. The ceremony was simple, as she would have wanted. A linen cloth draped over the wooden coffin, a single crucifix placed upon it, and the rosary returned to her hands one final time. The remaining sisters gathered at the front pews, heads bowed in song. Luca stood at the altar, his vestments plain, his voice firm yet soft as he began the Mass. As he reached the final benediction, his voice trembled. Into your hands, O Lord, we commend your servant Tessa, a soul who bore the weight of stone, yet never let her faith fall. May her light, hidden for so long, now shine forever in your glory. As he spoke the final words, a sudden rustle echoed through the rafters above. From the broken frame of the chapel's high window, a relic shattered during a storm decades ago, dozens of white doves emerged, taking flight in unison. Their wings beat against the stillness, the sound like soft thunder. The congregation gasped, turning their faces upward as the birds circled once, then rose through the fractured beams into the sky. At that moment, the clouds shifted and a single beam of sunlight cut through the eastern window, long forgotten, stained with dust and age. The light passed through the fractured glass, bending, refracting, and landed on the center of the altar in a shape unmistakable, a perfect cross. Light, pure, undeniable. No one spoke. No one needed to. The silence itself became a prayer, a reverence not for answers, but for presence. Something had been witnessed, not explained, not proven, but felt. Father Luca closed his eyes, his tears silent, his heart full. You are home, Tessa, he whispered. And now so am I. He did not know if it was miracle or mere coincidence. He did not care, because in that chapel, beneath the same stones that once held her captive, surrounded by voices she had once sung beside, faith had returned, not in thunder or visions, but in the quiet certainty that love had endured beyond reason, that the voice of a girl who sang in the dark had guided them all back to the light. And that even after all those years, even buried beneath earth and fear, faith had not died. It had waited, and it had been found. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more hidden stories like this to light. What detail from Tessa's journey struck you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We read every one.